Hi, welcome to the Analysts with Jake Novak. I'm Jake Novak, and the conventions are over. We sort of, I guess, know who the candidates are going to be now. Who knows? Things can change. But honestly, now there are a couple of things that we need to set out so that people understand where we are in this election and what is really the most important thing to focus on, or what are the most two or three most important things to focus on. I can't start without acknowledging the elephant in the room, so let me do that right now. This is going to be a very close election. Anyone with dreams of somebody winning even the popular vote by 4, 5, 6, or 7 points is just that, dreaming. Anyone who thinks that there's going to be someone who approaches 350 to 370 or more electoral college votes is dreaming. That's not going to happen. And of course, what that all means is that this election is going to come down to much fewer than 100,000 votes total in all of the swing states combined. So in other words, if you take the margin of victory, the plus minus margin of victory for whoever wins this election, just with the popular votes of the swing states in mind, you're going to get a number of under 100,000. That's what we're dealing with here. So it's just that number, that small number of voters that will swing this election. And if anybody knows anything about how elections go, you have a very engaged public, especially in this era of social media and all news channels, who have made their decisions a long, long time ago. And then there are people who really haven't made their decisions yet because they haven't even considered it yet. They are incredibly passive people. They may or may not vote. It's that person who just barely decides to vote. That's the kind of person who will decide this election. So everything that we talk about here on the Analysts from here on out really needs to be said in that context. We can't talk about grand ideas or engaging a certain base or talking about any kind of major grand strategies without realizing that the people who will decide this election may not be watching. By the way, that requires a little bit more humility than candidates and their political consultants have. I mean, imagine being a political consultant and charging the big money to a candidate and saying, you know what, Bob, you may win or may lose. It's going to be someone who isn't even going to see any of the work that we're doing here right now. That would probably not get you the job, right? So it's one of those things that people need to talk about. Also, in this day and age, it needs to be done in the context of the get out the vote effort. For those of you watching right now who have a candidate you really, really like or a candidate you really, really hate, ask yourself, what are you doing to make sure that the voters for the candidate you want show up on election day? A lot of you could probably register some of your friends right now or family members who aren't registered right now. And more importantly, you might want to talk to them about getting them to the polls or helping them get to the early voting sites that will open very soon around this country. I'm not electioneering for anyone, but I'm asking you what you think is more effective. And of course, that's going to be a huge part of it, the get out the vote effort. And in this day and age, with so much mail-in balloting, get out the vote means different things than it did just a few years ago. Now, as you know, for those of you who watch The Analysts, I am a big opponent of mail-in ballots under any circumstances for the simple reason, not talking about fraud, no conspiracy theories here, for the simple, indisputable reason that mail-in ballots are not secret ballots. Don't know who's watching when you're filling it out. Don't know who looks at the ballot afterwards. It's not a secret ballot, and that really makes them illegitimate in a democratic election. I know. We're not going to have a repeal of all mail-in ballots in this country anytime soon, but we should. That said, understand that the best way to beat back on that is to make sure that you vote in person. And I think that it's time for a lot of people to realize that they should vote early. I don't believe in voting early by mail-in ballot for reasons I just explained. But if there is a actual polling place that you can go to, a physical voting machine that you can go to early, you probably should. You never know what'll happen. Again, if only if you care about the results of this election, and maybe get some of your friends and relatives to do the same. Now, I want to talk about what this election is going to be about. Now, we'd all like to say, at least in public, that we want the election to be about the issues. The issues. We're very proud of ourselves when we talk about the issues, the issues. A lot of people, when they say that, can't actually name the issues, or they'll say something very amorphous like the economy, which is not a terrible thing to say. But again, I think you need to get more specific and say things like the job market, or in this case, inflation. That would be a little bit more credible. But it does seem more and more like this election is going to be not even ashamed about the fact that they're going to make it about personalities, at least from the Democratic side. I'm seeing more and more, especially now that Donald Trump is back on Twitter X, I'm seeing more and more Democrats, or more and more people in general, going on social media and publicly talking about how they can't vote for Donald Trump because he's quote unquote not presidential. Now, that may or may not be true. If you want to talk about rude behavior or things that you wouldn't post on your own social media feed, I can understand that. But folks, I don't think that there's too much of an argument right now about the world being on fire. We can argue about whose fault it is, and that's fine. But folks, the world is on fire. October 7th has happened. We have had an open border for 3.75 years that even the Democrats now call a crisis. We have rampant inflation. People are spending more of their personal income for food, a higher percentage of it for food than ever before since they've been recording that statistic. And there are many other things going on around the world right now that make pretending to be so offended by somebody like Donald Trump's words on Twitter or on other social media platforms to be your actual issue in this election. I don't buy it for a second. That's what I call a fake because. But it's worse than a fake because it is a self-aggrandizing, vain self-because. Really, at this day and age, you're really going to let people know how high and mighty you are by being so public about being angry about a word that a president uses when we have so many serious issues facing us? Again, vote for Donald Trump or don't vote for Donald Trump. But please, don't tell me that if your house was on fire and the firefighters came to put out that fire, that you wouldn't let them in because there was mud on their boots. If you are that kind of person, please don't only not vote, but please don't live on my block because fires tend to spread from one house to the other. You know what I mean? Folks, this is a serious time in our country. This is a serious time for the world. And if you're really going to try to make this election, which I think the Democrats really are, about personalities here, and make it about how you don't personally like Donald Trump, and that's why you should vote, and trying to make Kamala Harris look more likable and fun and collegial, well, I just, again, have to say, please don't vote. You really shouldn't be in this process right now. I can't stop you from voting, but I would ask you not to vote on that kind of an issue, or at least be honest that that's what you're voting, why you're voting, and let somebody like me try to get you to talk about the issues a little bit more and maybe either change your mind or at least vote for a better reason. We can't have this in this country anymore. This is no longer voting for example, Barack Obama, because he seems like the cooler guy than John McCain. This is no longer even about voting for somebody like Ronald Reagan because he makes me feel patriotic. That was probably fine back in 1980 and 84, but frankly, there were some issues, luckily, behind Ronald Reagan's campaign that made him a better reason to vote for him. But let's be honest, we vote out of our emotions. The good news is that if you are a well-adjusted, somewhat well-informed person, your emotions will be in line with reality. This is true of dating, too. It's an emotional decision who we want to date or marry. And a lot of us know we probably don't make a flowchart of the pros and cons of that person that we want to date and marry. But it's a good sign when your emotions and whatever other emotions, other part of your body is making your choice about who you're going to date or marry, also lines up with the facts and also lines up with reality. In other words, you might be attracted to a stripper, but if that stripper also has a PhD and owns the club, then maybe it's more than just your emotions that's making that decision. Sorry, that's a lewd analogy, but I think it gets the point across. Folks, this election cannot be about personalities anymore because of where we are right now in the world. We have a crime problem. We have an open border problem. We have a looming world war that's really been brewing, I think, for 10 years that we must start to reverse the trend of. These are all too important right now for us to ignore and to decide and actually even go out in public as an unserious person, pretending you're serious and saying, I can't vote for someone because he used a nasty nickname on Twitter. And if the reason why you're voting for Donald Trump is because you think that Kamala Harris is too silly, that's not good enough either. You should make the point that you don't think that her policies are serious. The fact that she's acting a little bit goofy and sometimes doesn't even seem coherent, look, that's bad news, and I can see that as being a reason why you won't like her. But try to back it up because that's what we need right now. Let's make it unacceptable in America to say you're not voting for someone because of a personality trait. Let's do that. That's something we can do. We may not be able to change the course of the world, but we can do that at least. Well, we've had a lot of developments in just the last couple of weeks since the last episode of The Analysts. We've had a Democratic National Convention. We've had the blockbuster decision by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to endorse Donald Trump. We're going to talk first about the Democrats and where they go from here and how things have developed for them. And then later in the show, we're going to talk about the Trump campaign and what the RFK Jr. endorsement means. We're going to come back with all of that next here on The Analysts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Dudo, and welcome to Buy,
Hold, Sell. If you have the Russians that are going into Ukraine, the Americans and the Germans and everyone else in Europe is going to say, hell no.
If Russia doing things, logically was their MO, I'd agree with you. Yeah, Todd, why don't you get him on a phone call right now? Hello, you.
Hi, welcome back to the Analysts with Jake Novak. I'm Jake Novak, and since you saw us last time, the Democratic National Convention has come and gone, and I want to get some strong analysis of what exactly happened at that convention first with our guest, MaryAnna Mancuso. She's a Republican strategist. MaryAnna, look, we are not a crazy partisan show here. We try to measure things from just being as impartial as we possibly can. Of course, everyone is biased, and I never claim to be unbiased. I'm sure no human being can do that. But what my overall impression of the Democratic National Convention was, it was basically a safety, kind of what they call it in pool. I'm just going to do a safety here. I think that they showed that they had some enthusiasm, and that was good, and that's very easy to do. But I don't really think they lost anything. I think and I'll go into some details about what opportunities they missed, but I don't really think they harmed themselves too much in that convention, if at all. What are your overall impressions of that convention?
The DNC convention of 2024 was very reminiscent of the 2008 convention when Barack Obama accepted the nomination. And there was a lot of excitement and fervor. On the very last night, there was the online rumor of a special guest, and people thought it was Beyonce. They thought it was Taylor Swift. And so we saw all of this excitement surrounding it. But again, this was essentially, as conventions are, political party conventions are often the Super Bowl for politicos and people who are highly engaged voters. And that's really what we saw at the DNC. We saw a lot of pomp and circumstance. We saw a lot of speeches. We saw people cross over. Republicans come over and give speeches at the DNC. Adam Kinzinger, Stephanie Grisham, different former Trump administration officials and congressmen. And then we saw Oprah. So it was a very big kind of star-studded event with a lot of excitement surrounding it as the Democrats were heading into what is now the final 70 days as we are talking today.
Yeah, I'm going to give a quick 3 pros and 3 cons of the convention. Again, one of the pros is they had decent enthusiasm. 2 is, and you got to give them some credit for this, this is a messed up election cycle for them. They literally just switched out their candidate at the last minute, pretty close to the convention, and they did that, and everyone was pretty much acting kind of normally. There wasn't a big confusion there as far as who was in charge. I didn't see anyone walking around with the Joe Biden-Harris poster as opposed to a Harris Walz poster. Stuff like that was done pretty well, and I have to give them some credit for that. And I think that there was a clarity of their message. Now, I don't think it's great for America, as I said in the monologue. I think they made it clear that this is a campaign that's anti-Trump, about 90% anti-Trump and 10% other stuff. I think Kamala Harris mentioned Trump, some incredibly large number of times in her acceptance speech. Again, comparing that to Ronald Reagan in 1980 when he mentioned Jimmy Carter's name just once. But I give them credit for that kind of at least uniformity. Now, the 3 things I would say they did poorly was, first of all, they missed out on a lot of opportunities. There was no, like I said earlier, there was no policy that they really strapped onto. A lot of times people want to be able to say, I voted for her because of this one policy. You got to give people that excuse for voting that goes beyond, I don't like Donald Trump, or I think she has a nice smile. They didn't give them that. There wasn't any one policy that anyone can say, oh, they're for this. I mean, even abortion, they didn't exactly hammer home. I mean, they mentioned in a lot of their speeches, but they didn't make that the center part of a slogan or a poster or something like that. Second of all, they missed a huge opportunity to address the elephant in the room. Kamala Harris's speech should have started with a much longer part of it discussing how messed up this is. If you ask 10 Americans from all parties what they think of this election cycle, they'll use the term messed up, maybe something even a little bit more colorful, but a lot of them will use the term messed up. If I were a political consultant, I would tell my candidate, please look into the camera and say, look, I know this is messed up, but let's do what we can do with our opportunity now. That would have been very endearing, and it would have been a good connector for, I think, Kamala Harris and the rest of the public. But her consultants probably think it's best to ignore this elephant in the room, which is always a mistake. I think it's a mistake in journalism, and I think it's a mistake in politics. And the last thing I would say is there was a lot of shouting. Now, Barack Obama gave a speech in a normal tone of voice. Kamala Harris, for the most part, gave a speech in a normal tone of voice, and Bill Clinton had to because his voice was weak. But it felt like every other speaker, whether it was Josh Shapiro or Tim Walz or everyone else who spoke, was yelling, 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 which again, to me, made it all about hating Donald Trump. And that I don't think is necessarily going to carry them over the finish line. So that's my 3 pros, 3 cons. You don't have to do 3 and 3, but what do you think about what were your pros and cons?
Well, I think that what was really interesting is if you would have told me 10 years ago that we would see a person running for president on the Democrat side run on a conservative platform, I would have been like, there's no way. And we saw that in Kamala's speech that she's running a very conservative platform. And I thought that was very interesting. And really what their entire convention was about talking about freedom and creating a contrast between what 4 years of Kamala Harris-Walz administration will look like versus a Trump-Vance administration. And that's what they've really been working. And to your point of them not admitting or acknowledging the fact that this election cycle is very shortened because we have a new presidential candidate at the top of the Democrat ticket. The truth is that the theme of the convention, as with all conventions, is it starts with, this is where we are. And the first night, it's like, we are here, we're looking back. And then as you move through the convention, it's looking into the future and moving forward. And that is why we saw Joe Biden address the DNC the first night. And you saw with the signs where it said, we love Joe, which, gives a little heartburn to some people that were supporters of Joe Biden because he was pushed out by his party. And the last time I think this is really important to underscore here, the last time that we saw this as an American electorate for the top of the ticket to be pushed out and not be able to run for re-election was Franklin Pierce's re-elect. And that was, in case you're keeping score, it was in the 1850s. It was during the convention for the DNC. Franklin Pierce came to the floor, turned over his delegates, supported James Buchanan, who would then go on and win the nomination as well as the presidential election. And the way that it happened was that Franklin Pierce was again forced out by his party because of bad legislation and bad policy. It was over the bloody Kansas-Nebraska Act, which has caused a lot of heartburn for Democrats. And so he was asked to not run again, and he did step down in the beginning of June at the DNC convention. So this is not the first time that we've seen this for all of us around right now in 2024. It does seem very shocking. Honestly, as a political strategist and as a former campaign operative, I can tell you that I am loving this shortened election. This is how they do it in Great Britain across the pond. I'm not advocating for that normally, but it is kind of nice. You have such a short sprint to the election day, and the voter fatigue is very real heading into this election. As you saw earlier with a Biden-Trump matchup, the electorate was not excited. They weren't energized. They weren't enthused. They were, disappointed that we were having a rerun of the election of 1892, where it was Grover Cleveland versus Benjamin Harrison. And so I think that seeing a new person on the ticket against Trump is very interesting and exciting for everybody. But again, right now, these are highly engaged, highly informed voters. It is not your average American voter.
You're a lot younger than I am, so I need to ask this question to you right now. One of the things that hit me very hard was how late so many of these convention speeches were, the key speakers of the night. Joe Biden at almost 11:30 Eastern time. Some of the other speakers even later than that. I think Tim Walz went even later than that. And even Kamala Harris, who they got on the stage, I think, before 10:30. Listen, when I was a kid, going after 9 p.m. would have been a huge, huge problem. But again, the reason why I noted your age is maybe this is just me being an old fogey. Maybe they're just thinking about repackaging these speeches on social media the next day. It doesn't matter about the live audience. What is your thought about how late these speeches started? And am I just being an old fogey here?
No, they were way past my bedtime. Let's be honest. They were so late. But I think to your point, they were looking to repackage and repurpose through social media because so many people these days are looking to see and get their information regarding the election through social media, different platforms and things like that. So I do think that they were definitely looking to that. I think it is also notable. We did see later speeches at the RNC. It is just now at this point, all of the excitement and party business is bleeding into the evening where I am, to be honest with you, I'm glad that I wasn't at the DNC or the RNC because your girl's got to get to bed. I need my beauty rest.
All right. Convention's over now. I'm going to give you 2 options. You tell me as a strategist what you think the Democrats should do if you were working for them. Mm-hmm. Should they start to inject more policy in their discussion, which I know is the answer you want to give for your college professor or your AP political science professor to get an A. But so if you answer that, please don't do it because of that reason. Should they start to inject more policy and more specific policy, or should they just put all their chips in what they do, what they're very comfortable in doing, and just make it about a bash Trump fest for the next 60 or 70 days?
Look, I like a good policy debate. I think I'm probably nerdier than most, so I acknowledge that. But what's really important is for them to underscore what they're going to do should they win on election day. And I think that we are seeing some policy, but the thing is that I think it's really getting drowned out through social media, because the things that are going viral, the things that are being passed around, are not the policy conversations on either side. And I think that's very important to underscore here. Neither side has the ability any longer, because we have a 24/7 news cycle. We have viral videos. We have influencers joining into the campaign, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram or Twitter or X or whatever we're calling that today. And I think that that kind of hinders the ability to have a true policy discussion. However, it does not let either campaign off the hook. And we have to talk about what 4 years of either Trump Vance or Harris Walz looks like.
All right, last question in this segment for you. What is the most important issue in this election? I know the polls say economy, and you can say economy, and why? Or have another issue. What is really the number one issue in this election?
Well, are we asking what's the number one issue to myself or to the electorate?
The electorate.
I think that might strike a little different, but it probably won't. I will tell you that one of the biggest driving issues right now is going to be abortion, and it will be those culture issues, because that is where we are seeing a lot of focus happening. We saw in the midterm election, or off-year election, excuse me, in 2023 in Ohio, we saw women voters, Republicans, cross over and vote Democrat to protect their right to choose for their body over their tax cuts. And I think that that's really important. And I think as we go further in, you're going to hear more of those conversations, because women are concerned about that. Now, also, it is notable that another big issue will be immigration, and they will want to talk about border control. Now, what's important to note is that under Joe Biden's presidency and administration, border crossings are down. They are down compared to where they were under former President Donald Trump. And I think that that's going to be interesting. The economy is also going to be a really big driver, as you've mentioned, because groceries are expensive and people are worried about how they are going to make ends meet. And it's going to be those pocketbook issues. At the end of the day, it will be a determinant of which party can show that their candidate is prime and suited to serve the public for the next 4 years.
All right, thanks, MaryAnna. We're going to come back after this break and talk about the big changes on the Republican side of the ledger. It hasn't been uneventful for them. And we'll talk about especially the decision by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to drop out, essentially, and to endorse Donald Trump. We'll be right back with the Analyst with Jake Novak. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back to The Analyst with Jake Novak. I'm Jake Novak. With me today is MaryAnna Mancuso. She's a Republican strategist. We've been talking so far in the show about the Democratic National Convention, giving the Democrats some advice and the Harris Walz campaign some insights on where they may go and where they should go. Let's talk now about the Trump campaign, the Trump Vance campaign, and where they're going right now. Now, of course, the big news since the last time we did an episode here on The Analyst is the fact that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., independent candidate, but of course coming from the Democratic side of the ledger, has dropped out of the race, essentially, officially suspending his campaign. But he has endorsed Donald Trump for president, and he made a very interesting speech on Friday calling for voters to vote for Donald Trump because of a number of issues. And interestingly, I thought what was most interesting was that he started his speech talking about the crimes, really, there's no other word for it, the crimes that have been committed against him by the Democratic Party. Anti-democratic moves, pushes to outspend him to the point where he wouldn't be able to go to court and successfully win and afford to win cases to get his name on the ballot. The censorship of the material that he was promoting, and on down the line. And then he talked about these essential issues for the whole country that he's very concerned about, primarily the health of the American public and things about the pharmaceutical industry as well. And I don't think that there was any real doubt in his mind, and probably even the voters' minds, that Donald Trump will certainly be at least looking into those issues. That's how you talk about politics being engaged in a healthful way. Just your first impressions, MaryAnna Mancuso, not only of the decision by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but the way that it was done at that news conference, and then again a little bit later that same day at a rally for Donald Trump. What were some of your impressions about how that entire process played out?
Look, I'm not surprised that RFK suspended his campaign, RFK Jr. suspended his campaign at all. I think that it was kind of the writing was on the wall, and it was a matter of who he was going to back. And it made the most sense for him to support Trump-Vance ticket over Harris-Walz. And that is mainly because what we saw initially in early polling between Trump-Harris and RFK Jr. and even Trump-Biden, RFK Jr., RFK Jr. pulled from Trump versus Biden or Harris. And I think that that's really important. And so Trump being able to bring RFK Jr. into the fold and receive the endorsement. Now, it does look like it is very quid pro quo, because what happened is shortly after RFK Jr. announced that he would be endorsing Donald Trump for president, it was announced the day or so after that Trump has announced his transition team, as all presidential candidates do. I just want to pause here and back out really quick to give your viewers a little more insight, because a lot of people don't know this. When you're running for president, as you get down to the wire of the last couple of months of the campaign, it's usually after convention, you appoint what is known as a transition team and prepare in preparation in case you win the election, and then you can prepare to start the administration, hit the ground running when you take office in January. So former President Donald Trump has appointed his transition team. RFK Jr. was named to that transition team, and I don't think that that was a surprise by anybody, because if you remember, also we saw some huge supporters of Donald Trump, such as Joe Rogan and others, Tim Pool, were backing RFK Jr. And him losing that support is a really big problem for Trump's base. This is going to be, as every election is, a base election. And so for him to get the endorsement of RFK Jr. was really a big deal for the Trump-Vance ticket.
You know, you mentioned Joe Rogan, and I didn't think that I thought Joe Rogan was always, he supported Bernie Sanders last time and maybe the election before as well. And I didn't think he was necessarily an open. I know he is does not like Kamala Harris and bashes her regularly. But I thought that one of the biggest factors in this RFK endorsement is if, and we're still saying if, Joe Rogan really comes along and strongly, explicitly endorses Donald Trump, and probably even more importantly, does a joint show with Trump and RFK Jr. So am I wrong about that? Has Joe Rogan endorsed Trump in the past, or has that not happened yet?
He's been supportive of, he has not endorsed, but he has spoken ill of Trump's candidacy and in support of, not an endorsement of, RFK Jr.'s candidacy, which caused a massive shakeup. It is very important to note here, a massive shakeup and concern, because what happens is if that is emanating through the base, Donald Trump has a serious issue come the election.
Okay, so that's a good clarification. So we would both agree that if Rogan comes out more clearly and supports Trump now, that will help him, or at least help stop the bleeding. This is something that's interesting that I think a lot of people need to understand, and I talked about it in the monologue. Healthy politics is all about deciding what compromises you're going to make, and if the compromise is that you can't win an election because it shows that you're not doing any better than 4% nationally, then it's not that much of a compromise to drop out in return for some kind of guarantees that at least some of your issues will be advanced. So I don't really think there's anything crazy about it. I mean, the mainstream news media's decision to use the word crazy to describe the whole process and to try to absolutely impugn the character of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in ways they hadn't already done before seemed to be a little bit over the top. Any chance that that backfires and people said, wait a minute, I actually looked at his issues and they don't seem crazy to me?
I don't think so. I mean, I think RFK Jr. in general has a bit of a PR problem on his own. I don't think he needs a lot of assistance from the media. It doesn't help him, but it also, I think that he just has kind of his own problems, whether it is, the article about the bear in Central Park or just all these other things that seem to really weigh him down, which, to your point, impede the general public in understanding where he stands on the issues, because they can't get through the insanity that surrounded him and his candidacy. And so I think him dropping out and, ultimately deciding to endorse the candidate that's going to give him something for his endorsement was not unlikely, nor surprising, to be quite honest with you, as we head into the final 70 days of this cycle.
We wrapped up the last segment saying, what choice would you present to the Democrats if it was a choice between going with more policy or just bashing Donald Trump? So let's do this for the Republicans now, but a slightly different question. What is something that you think the Trump campaign should emphasize right now that they haven't been emphasizing as much? And second, should it be about continuing where you're going as far as where they do rallies and how they do that? Would you advise a certain different strategy in addition to the rallies? I mean, I don't think Trump can suddenly stop doing the rallies. I think that would be a mistake, and I think you'd agree. But is there something else that they should be doing from a logistical standpoint? So from messaging and logistics, what would be your two messages to the Trump campaign?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to look at the Trump campaign and notice that it is completely apparent to me that he's flailing. The Trump campaign is really struggling right now because they can't seem to get their feet under them because they still think they're running against Joe Biden. They're trying to throw different items, whether it's nicknames or just trying to throw different things against Kamala Harris and her campaign, whether it's questioning her racial identity. All of these things, they're trying so hard to see what sticks, and you only have 70 days, and that's not a lot of time. And I think that they really would be better to recognize that they're not running the campaign they thought they were against Joe Biden. They've got to get their candidate in shape. And when I mean in shape, I mean paying attention. He just did an ad buy in Palm Beach County in South Florida, which is actually a very red area for him around where they purchased the ad buys so that he could see his ad on the television at Mar-a-Lago. That tells me that they're looking to stroke his ego and the campaign is not being heard. There's also talks about campaign switch up, whether they're moving the co-chairs and bringing in Corey Lewandowski, who's been attending high staff level meetings. And then you have the candidate who is out on the golf course, which is not very helpful. He's not holding as many rallies as he was as we headed into and right before the attempted assassination. And that lends to tell me that there's a problem with the candidate. And I'm not saying health-wise, I'm just saying that he is having some problems internally, whether it's not knowing what's going to happen, thinking he's going to lose and hoping to blame somebody else. He needs to get out there with his vice president. The vice president is out there campaigning and hoping to bring home the election. But JD Vance cannot bring home a win for the Republican ticket by himself.
I think that the election's coming down to Pennsylvania. I think that that's really the state because again, I think some other states will go the same as Pennsylvania does. Do you think that should be a focus? Should that be somewhere where Trump and Vance spend more time? And also, do you agree that that's really part of the election math right now, that it is going to come down to Pennsylvania?
I don't think it just comes down solely to Pennsylvania. I think also you want to look at North Carolina. I know that there's been a lot of talk recently about Florida, and I will say this today until November 6th, the day after the election, Florida is not in play. Florida is red. It is Trump country. And I think that that's very important. So really, if I'm advising the Trump campaign, I'm telling them to focus in Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and make sure that they have all of their other diehard red states in lock. We know that in Georgia specifically, he's begun closing victory offices, which again is telling me that's a campaign in peril. I don't know if he's running out of money, but I know he's not making wise financial decisions when it comes to ad buys. He's also spending in the Panhandle in Matt Gaetz's district, another very Republican area of Florida. If I'm advising him on campaign buys and I'm telling him where to put his money, I'm not telling him to pour it into Florida. I'm telling him to look to other battleground states.
MaryAnna Mancuso, very good advice, very strong advice, and a lot of reasoning behind it. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of The Analyst. Thanks everybody else for watching. We'll be back really soon. And as I always say at the end of every one of these episodes and editions that we do, a lot is likely to change between now and the next few days, let alone the next time we put together another edition of The Analyst in a week or so. I'm Jake Novak. Thanks for watching.